Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future Podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And today we're going to be talking about Appalachia. And to help us with that, we've got two experts in the field, Renn, whose work on the future of Appalachia was just published, really terrific report. Aaron is a consultant and researcher on the topic, has been a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and City Hall on the topic of regional development. And Jessie is a public policy researcher in Washington, D.C., working with AEI, set to pursue graduate study, by the way, at University in Oxford in England. Originally from Southern Appalachia, Jessie is dedicated to furthering Appalachia's flourishing and development. Jessie and Aaron, welcome.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Joel, you want to kick us off?
Sure. The report you did for urban reform that just came out, Aaron, for generations, we've always assumed that Appalachia was always going to be, the caboose of the American economy. Do you see anything that's turning around, and do you think Appalachia will begin to sort of reclaim something economically compared to what most people believe?
Yeah, so the Appalachian region is quite large. The area as defined by the government's Appalachian Regional Commission is 435 counties that spans from Mississippi to New York State. And what I found was actually there are some places in Appalachia that are starting to grow, and they're basically mostly in the South. And if there's a huge split within Appalachia that mirrors the split between, you could think of it as the old North and the new South, between the Frost Belt and the Sun Belt. And the parts of Appalachia that are in the southern growth zone, which I define as the area south of the northern borders of Tennessee and North Carolina, we're actually starting to see quite a bit of growth there in terms of population and jobs across a large number of counties. Mississippi sort of accepted, but in Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, a lot of growth is happening. And I call this organic growth. Not necessarily because it's all happening from within the community, but because it's happening by the force of the market without any sort of public policy intervention. People are just moving south. They're moving to warm weather. We've seen rivers of people flowing into these places. Southern Appalachia is heavily adjacent to major metropolitan areas like Atlanta, like Charlotte, Nashville, Birmingham, Alabama, and some smaller ones that are doing well. Knoxville, Chattanooga, Huntsville, they're all inside the Southern Appalachia region. And so we're seeing a lot of people move in there. A lot of people are moving in, and that can be a mixed blessing for the existing residents, as you know. But we are seeing things move in there. The northern part of Appalachia is, more stagnant, I would say, in keeping with the northern United States as a whole. There's nothing particular, I think, to Appalachia about that. But even there, I saw some opportunities developing from remote work, which we can talk about kind of separately, but that was a big focus of the report. Does remote work offer opportunities? And I think provisionally it offers some incremental opportunities in the North as well as in the South.
Jessie, you grew up there. I assume you still come home. Have you noticed any of the changes that Aaron is writing about?
Certainly. I think the tone of the report is really hopeful for me. I think growing up, there was always this narrative that if you wanted to be successful, you kind of had to leave. And, 20 odd years later, I'm in Washington, D.C., meeting a lot of people who've never been to Tennessee, but say, I want to retire there. That's the place I want to go because it's beautiful and it's cheap and the land is cheap. And that was odd to me. But every time I go home, the community where I'm from was not a suburb when I was growing up. It's becoming a suburb and the land is changing quickly. As Aaron notes in the report, it's a mixed blessing. It's exciting for the economy. I'm from the southern part of the report that he's talking about. So that growth has been exciting, but there's also a want to preserve the land as it is, preserve the culture, and that tug of war with progress as well as preservation is going to be ongoing for Southern Appalachia. And I think for Northern Appalachia, there's a lot of growth that is yet to be had. And I'm curious to see the lessons Aaron has on offer here kind of be taken up by places in the North and see what they can do with it.
Well, the Northern Appalachia has been so linked with mineral extraction, natural resource extraction. Are you seeing a diversification of the economy there?
Yeah, I mean, it's still very heavily resource extraction. Coal mining as an industry has been tremendously in decline, but natural gas has been coming on strong through fracking and things like that. There's also a lot of heavy industry there. People don't necessarily think of Appalachia and heavy industry, but there's a ton of it. Pittsburgh is the largest metropolitan area entirely within the Appalachian region. And, it was obviously historically a steel town, but not anymore. But you go along the Ohio River, you drive down these highways in West Virginia, you'll see some gigantic chemical plant, or you'll see a gigantic Marathon oil refinery, or you'll see some other piece of heavy industry there. Shell just built a $6 billion ethane cracker plant in Pennsylvania, where they're going to take this cheap fracked natural gas and convert it into, plastics feedstock, basically. And so there is a lot of heavy industry there. And then there's also tourism is also a big business. And so you can imagine that these things are sort of in conflict with each other. And then I would say, in limited numbers of places, there is, even some high tech in select metropolitan areas. Again, Pittsburgh has become sort of a high tech metro area, because of Carnegie Mellon University. Huntsville, Alabama, very associated with the space program. Knoxville is a major university town. So there are sort of these places that we don't think of them as Appalachia. And that's what happens whenever a place in Appalachia gets successful, we sort of recode it as something else, it's like, it's nice to show you how, poverty is sort of and rural and there, although there is a lot of that, there's also, some pockets of other things as well.
Your report was really terrific, I thought, and very educational for me. It pointed out the historic cultural roots, being very focused on immigration from England and Scotland, Ireland. Is that ethnic base diversifying? Are we seeing a lot of influx from Asian culture, from other European cultures, from like for instance in Minneapolis, you see a lot of people from Africa who have come in from a refugee perspective. Is that happening within the Appalachian region, or is it more kind of traditionalist?
Yeah. So this area was, originally settled, at least a lot of it was, by the Scots-Irish. The story of that is told greatly in David Hackett Fisher's book, Albion's Seed, which is a wonderful, very long, but very just wonderful book. And, that's still the base, call it the base ethnic stock. I think sort of self-conscious ethnic identity has faded. The Scots-Irish are the people who are most likely today to describe themselves as simply American on the census. But what I would say is the area has seen an influx of more kind of racial and ethnic diversity, but it's still overwhelmingly white. And in fact, although it's becoming more diverse, like the entire United States, it has actually been becoming more diverse at a slower rate than the nation as a whole, meaning Appalachia is actually getting whiter relative to the rest of the country. There simply isn't a huge amount of diversity there in most places. Where you do see like an influx of Latinos or immigrants is in the North Georgia, for example, which is really part of Atlanta. Atlanta has, now basically all of North Georgia. And so like huge percentage of the diversity is in some of the places like that. And then there are some areas in the rural South, especially in Mississippi, Alabama, where there are historically large Black populations. There are some counties in Appalachia in the ARC region that are, majority Black. Again, it's not thought of that way, but that's really more of a historic, I think, population than that. So, a lot of places have said immigration is really what's going to drive repopulation or population growth. In Appalachia, there's probably going to be some, and especially in like North Georgia, but it's really probably more domestic migration. I think it's some of those people who are talking about retiring there, as Jessie said, maybe the same sorts of people who are moving to places like Idaho and Montana, that kind of profile.
Jessie, I know your area, not quite North Georgia, but in that direction, has when you go to your local town, your high school, hasn't it changed tremendously? We saw some of this when we were working in Northwest Arkansas, a similar thing.
It has changed and it's continuing to change. I would say my county profile is probably more similar to the North Georgia county profile that Aaron is referencing, with a huge percentage change in particular Hispanic immigration, primarily because we're starting from about zero, 30 years ago. So a couple people is a huge percentage change, but it has really started to grow. And there are new businesses, speaking of historic downtowns and the need to kind of revitalize those, there's been new businesses crop up in our own historic downtown that are Hispanic restaurants or Hispanic small town businesses. And a lot of that dynamism and entrepreneurship that I think will help spark an exciting and flourishing Appalachia has come from the Hispanic community. I think where, like you were saying, Aaron, in the north, kind of West Virginia, Kentucky, where maybe that won't be driven by Hispanic immigrants, there's a lot of young people in the Washington, D.C. area who are kind of thinking, oh, well, I'll go hybrid work from West Virginia. And I think that domestic migration that you're talking about could really be a big driver as more people can hybrid work, and we can circle back on the remote work point there. But the short answer is yes, and I think it's an exciting thing for at least East Tennessee and North Georgia to see that influx.
Well, I suspect the cost of housing has been a huge boost to the region. And the fact that in this world where people can relocate because of remote work, the idea of being able to find a place in Appalachia that's significantly less expensive than living elsewhere has driven people probably into the region. Is that true, or is that just wishful thinking?
Yeah, I think it's true. It's probably not. I think there's this idea a lot of people have. Maybe it was shaped by some of the old stories that you could buy a house in Detroit for $100 or something like that. If you went to Detroit today, you're not buying a house for $100. I can tell you that. So I do think maybe the housing is not as dirt cheap as some people might think it is, but it's still pretty cheap. So one of the people that I interviewed and featured in the report is this gentleman named Nick Solheim, works in a nonprofit in DC. He and his wife bought a 3-acre spread in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, which you can commute in, a couple days a week. And, it was about $300,000, I think, which he said it would have cost twice as much to buy in Virginia. And Joel and I actually together visited, Chillicothe, Ohio, about an hour from Columbus, a beautiful little small town there. It's a little too far away that people in Ohio wouldn't want to be making an hour plus commute every day into Columbus. But if you're going, a couple of days a week, it's probably okay. And, again, you could get a 4-bedroom house in the center of town for under $250,000. And, I was looking at real estate listings and I'm seeing this like 5,000 square foot historic mansion. That's like $600K. I'm like, this is amazing.
So the economics are favorable in terms of trying to attract people. One of the things that you point out that has been a historic weakness of the area is educational attainment. It's at least in certain parts of Appalachia. How much of a shift are we seeing in growth of educational quality in the region, both north and south? Probably more north, right? I would think would be where the problem
haven't necessarily done that sort of time series analysis. I can tell you that 2/3 of Appalachian counties have a college degree attainment rate of below 20%. That is extremely low. The national average is, somewhere up north of 30. I think it's almost 33% right now. So you're looking at places with very low educational attainment. And, in my experience of small town America, the people with degrees are often, it's teachers. It's people like that. It's not knowledge, call it knowledge economy workers as understood. So that does heavily limit the ability of these communities to create, I call it knowledge economy businesses like high tech. There are some niche industries. We found a very cool app company in Marietta, Ohio, that makes software for like iPads that helps people who are either nonverbal or autistic or have aphasia who can't speak. It's a communications interface for them, and that's very cool. So there is some, I don't want to poo-poo it, and there's definitely some high tech in these big cities. Pittsburgh has definitely got high educational attainment, but definitely we're looking at places that have very, very low educational attainment in most places. And I don't think that there's been any material change in that in a while.
To circle back on the housing issue, I think, Aaron, one thing I'd be curious to hear some of your thoughts on with the influx of housing and potential costs going up. I know my county and a number of counties in our area have recently issued or are considering issuing moratoriums on suburbanizing lots. Say you can't have a lot with more than 2 houses on an acre, because we're really afraid of both the land changing and costs going up. It's kind of a two-pronged fear of cost as well as a real love of rural land. And you mentioned some things like maybe taxing non-homestead houses or things like that. Or what are your views on that concern?
Right. I think attempting to limit suburban development just drives housing costs up. Okay, so that's not going to be, a lot of people say they want to preserve the character and all of that, but those sorts of urban containment policies really drive housing prices up. So I would say that's counterproductive. I do think, one of the things I note is that in these places that have not seen much population growth and maybe even population decline, and they're not that large in terms of population, it doesn't take much incremental inflow of people with money to dramatically swing the real estate market. This happened in Maine, which had been sort of moribund for a long time. Pandemic, people move out there and, prices in some towns went up 60%. And it's a huge issue. And you also see that a lot of these places don't really have a home building industry. They haven't built any houses in forever. And so this idea, like, I want to start building some houses, like, and you see this, it's a big problem in a lot of rural America that there's just not a construction infrastructure to build things. And so that's a challenge. I think you can't just ramp, even if you said, okay, we're going to allow it, there are no developers who could develop like a big subdivision there.
Yeah, there was a issue with a developer nearby where they had to get a granite countertop from Asheville and then drive it 2 hours out into the mountains, and it fell off the mountain and they had to go back for another one.
It's that sort of stuff. Like there's no suppliers. And so, and this is, I think, part of a trend where like a lot of like rural hospitals and things, there's loss of services. I do think, what I look at is, what I see out in the West is a lot of times you had a lot of rich guys come in and buy up massive quantities of land and essentially just fence it off and said no trespassing unless you're part of one of my private hunts that I charge billions of dollars for. Other ones are, Airbnbs. We're going to buy up these houses. We're going to turn all these things into Airbnbs. Or I'm just going to have a vacation home here. I'm just going to have a vacation home. And what I would do is if I were going to look at policies, and this would have to be carefully thought through in terms of what it would be. I'm not saying that this is exactly what to do, but look at policies that limit out-of-town land ownership, short-term occupancy, vacation homes, those things that don't apply to people who live there. If somebody's living in a house or somebody's renting a house is where they live, that's one thing. So like one thing like the state of Michigan does, and that's very common, I think, in places with a lot of vacation homes, is just like a 50% homestead tax credit, which basically means property taxes are essentially double on people who aren't living in their houses. And so that's like that's like something that's designed to like make these out of town buyers, pay a lot more. And Yeah, I do worry about this because, like, Appalachia has been known for out of town land ownership. Much of Central Appalachia was completely owned by like all these out of town corporations, like coal mining companies and things like that, or they controlled mineral rights under things like the broad form deed in Kentucky, which we don't need to go into, which means that they really own the property, even if they didn't own the property. And you see out west, billionaires buying up all the land. I mean, it's easy for me to imagine some of these billionaires just coming in and buying up tens of thousands of acres in Appalachia and just switching from corporate ownership to like billionaire ownership. That would not necessarily be good for the region. So I do think
it could be the same thing with the same outcome. But let me just piggyback on one of the things you were talking about earlier. We were talking about people. Jessie was saying, people who are saying, I want to retire to Tennessee or places like that. Without a advanced infrastructure for healthcare, which of course involves the ability to build things, right, as well as having the knowledge workers in the healthcare industry to be there, how is that going to happen? What are the things that really need to be put in place that can upgrade the infrastructure of areas of Appalachia that make it attractive to full-time, long-term residents?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, you talk about retirement, like what are you going to do for healthcare? I think there are a lot of those, and it depends on where you are. One of the things that I did was I put together a map of essentially suburban and ex-urban areas of Appalachia that I thought would be the addressable geographic market for hybrid work, people who had to commute to a big city. And it was all the counties that were sort of suburban or ex-urban counties of a metropolitan area of 500,000 or more. Most of South Appalachia is in that zone. So you're within a couple counties probably of being able to get to a hospital if you need one. Whereas you get into West Virginia, you get into Eastern Kentucky, parts of Virginia, you're very remote from a major city. And so things like that become a little bit challenging. You go into Eastern Kentucky, there are just hardly any towns of any size.
So that the density of people really makes it unattractive to create the infrastructure, whether it's healthcare or whatever, right? So how do you beat that?
Yeah, well, I mean, like I don't know necessarily that I think building infrastructure to attract retirees is what I would do. I would be more, especially in the North. I have always advocated, look, you can't fight the tape, as they say in the stock market. When we look at people migrating to warm weather, you just can't. Nobody has cracked the code on how to get people to move into the frost belt in the Eastern US. And so the focus should be on the residents that you already have to some extent. Yes, you could try to do things for other people, but like very speculative things. To me, it's sort of like the rural version of the creative class. We're going to build all these art galleries to attract all these young millennials. Like, I'm going to build all this healthcare to attract all these retirees, I think would fall into that kind of category. I would be looking at rural healthcare as something that would certainly upgrade quality of life for the people who lived there, as well as potentially attracted others. But that was specifically, infrastructure for retirees was not something that I looked at in the report.
Right. But you look at a place like Asheville as an example, right, which has arguably, over the past 20 years, seen just a tremendous influx of people, both retirees and people who are actively working, turned itself into even more of a artistic hub. Is that a template that other areas of Appalachia can use? I mean, by the way, maybe Southern Appalachia or slightly Southern Appalachia, but it gets cold there in the wintertime.
Well, Asheville is a very interesting place, to say the least. The Biltmore Mansion is there, and there are a lot of extremely nice older homes. So this was a place that clearly had tremendous historic wealth. On the other hand, there doesn't seem to be any business there in terms of white-collar business. If you go to their downtown, it's very nice. It's very lively. There are a lot of businesses. There are a lot of people there. I don't think there's a single real office building in Asheville. And I was there like during the week walking around. I didn't see a single person that looked like an office worker type. It's all essentially tourism and other things of that nature. And so it's not like there are all these tech companies or things, there. So I would say, and there's some manufacturing, there is some industry there. So I'm not saying there's no business, but like, it's a city where, it is kind of like a lifestyle destination, much more. It's sort of like what Joel, I think, would have referred to as a productive resort. In a sense.
So
Maybe
is
that's an unfair
is that a template?
characterization.
Is that a template for other places in the South or in the Appalachia?
I think there are some possibilities that other places could, attract more people. It's not technically in the ARC definition of Appalachia, although it's definitely in the Appalachian region. But Roanoke, Virginia, very easily could have been another Asheville. And it's got a great downtown. Norfolk Southern Railroad was historically based there. There's some interesting transportation museum downtown I enjoyed visiting. And it's much less expensive. It's right about the same time, but it's got the mountains, it's got the Blue Ridge Parkway, it's got all that stuff. And I'm like, well, Roanoke, people always ask me, Aaron, what's a town that's like nobody knows about, nobody's discovered, and could be the next like great destination? And I said, Roanoke, Virginia might actually be one. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm predicting it's going to get hot, that I'm speculating in real estate there. Right? I don't own any real estate there. But I'm like, wow, this is like a quality small city that's not too expensive. Hasn't been, Asheville real estate prices have just gone to the roof. It's kind of crazy there.
Another good example is Johnson City, Tennessee, which made, I think, the top 10 of best places to buy a home on some list this year. But something that East Tennessee has done really well, that Asheville has done, that Aaron is talking about, is tourism. And I know Tennessee's tourism continues to bring in so much of the state's revenue from Dollywood, Gatlinburg, all of that, and almost commercialization of the Appalachian identity. And I don't think that that's a bad thing. I think Dollywood is peddling a pretty authentic version of Appalachia that has brought in a lot of revenue and a lot of jobs. And for some reason, West Virginia and Eastern Kentucky and even like Johnson City haven't really done the same thing. So it does seem like there's an opportunity to both preserve these towns and preserve the Appalachian identity, and also turn that into some sort of touristic expedition. I think you mentioned a couple of examples, Aaron, of endeavors to bring in more whitewater rafting money, for instance. There's a lot of opportunities for that.
Yeah, that Tri-Cities area in Tennessee, they've got an airport, so that gives them like an advantage. They do have a huge NASCAR track in Bristol. So there's some stuff going on there, but that's one that I think could use some focus for sure.
Joel, you're on mute.
Last things I wanted to deal with, I think, was a big issue, which is obviously climate change, which seems to me to be cutting in Appalachia several different ways. One, if things are getting hotter, the fact that the Appalachia has a higher elevation might make it more pleasant place to retire. Better to retire to Appalachian Tennessee than to retire in Central Florida if you're worried about the heat and other issues. The other part, of course, is that depending on how we deal with climate change, it would seem to me that it would be a great opportunity for the natural gas industry if as it was the case before, people saw natural gas as a winner in terms of sort of green energy. Now that the policy is against it, I mean, you could conceivably see the destruction of the American natural gas industry, and that would have a big impact. I mean, how do you think particularly assuming that the current regime is reelected, and these climate policies continue to happen, is there any impact that maybe some good, some bad for Appalachia?
There's already a phenomenon they call halfback migration, where somebody from the north retires to Florida and then moves halfway back into North Carolina or Tennessee. I did some migration analysis of Nashville for a different purpose. And Nashville, Tennessee actually has a significant net inflow of migrants from Florida.
Wow.
And if you look at a Midwestern state, all of the top outmigration destinations are Florida, Arizona. Some places are more Arizona, some places are more Florida. Some of these places in the upper South or the Mid-South are actually drawing from Florida. And I don't know if it's the weather or it's the price or it's the culture in Florida, but there's already a significant established flow of people moving north out of places like Florida into that. So I could definitely see, climate playing into that. When it comes to the green agenda, we'll just have to see what happens with regards to natural gas. I have no predictions there.
Jessie, you're in Washington. You probably hear the climate stuff all the time. Any thoughts about how that may affect the future of Appalachia?
I think that there's a couple interesting situations in East Tennessee. The energy provider is TVA, which is the largest publicly owned energy provider in the nation. And I'm not entirely sure why it's just in Tennessee and not in West Virginia or Kentucky. But I think that TVA is pretty well positioned to help navigate some of the climate and energy issues. I'm not an energy expert by any means and don't pretend to be. As far as migrating to those places, I think that Tennessee is and the rest of Appalachia is a pretty wonderful place. It's not near the coasts where you see natural disasters, pretty minimal wildfire issues. And to the extent that any of those things are real threats or just now becoming cultural fears, I think that places that are insulated from natural disasters that are potentially climate linked are going to become more and more popular.
This has been just a fascinating discussion, really, really interesting. Let me ask you this as kind of a final way of wrapping up. If you guys could wave the magic wand and say, okay, this is what I would like to see in place in order to see Appalachia grow, what would you do?
Well, I'm going to choose to highlight one aspect of the report that I thought was the most interesting and maybe most significant thing from a public policy perspective, which is this concept of remote work brokers. When people talk about remote work, they often talk about attracting like a Facebook remote employee or these hybrid workers who are working from home, but it's somebody who's not in your community already. But there's another type of remote work, which is about connecting people who are already in your community to higher wage remote work opportunities. And there were a couple companies in Appalachia. One was called Central App, another was called Octana, and I feature them. And they basically set themselves up as brokers, where they find people in Appalachia who are talented but have been overlooked, and they kind of vet them and identify them, and they train them in market relevant skills, Salesforce technology in both cases, and then they sort of use them as a staffing for sort of an IT staffing scenario. And it's been extremely beneficial to those people. I mean, life-changing results for some. This one guy got hired by his client at a six-figure job in Hazard, Kentucky. How many six-figure jobs are there in Hazard, Kentucky? Not very many. One of the people who worked for Octana had been a former coal miner who had previously been homeless. A lot of the people who work for Central App are stay-at-home moms who want a part-time job and things like that. And so these are sort of small scale at present, but I really think this concept of creating these entities that can serve as brokers to connect local existing residents to high value economic opportunity outside is something I would be looking to develop if I were
very interesting, tapping into the talent pool through remote work. What do you think, Jessie? What's your prescription?
Just to give a plug, I think that that's a wonderful idea that Aaron put in the report. In developing those examples further, I think one of the main issues in Appalachian history is people imposing solutions from the outside rather than letting solutions grow up from inside within the region. And I think one of my favorite lifelong things that happened when I was young that continues to exist today is free community college in Tennessee and technical training. And I think that that is still seeing the implications in Tennessee, but if Kentucky or West Virginia or Virginia or North Carolina did something similar, the reason to leave for getting education would go way down, and the amount of people who want to stay in Appalachia and bring their skills to Appalachia would go up. And I think that the more people who stay in Appalachia in the first place would limit the ongoing brain drain in the region, and help the people who are born there continue to use their gifts and skills and talents to contribute to a flourishing region. So that, combined with this kind of remote work opportunity within the region as well, I think would be a real recipe for a flourishing community.
Well, these have been some fantastic insights. Thank you both for spending time with us here at the Feudal Future podcast, and we look forward to having you back soon.
Thanks.
Thank
And
you.
good luck in England.
Good luck.
The Feudal Future.